Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much to the Heritage Council for inviting me to speak today. Thanks to Colin for giving me this peculiar title for my talk, Pig's Ear into Silk Purse, the Predicament of Small Houses in Rural Towns. If I repeat some of the points made by Grania and Kevin this morning, then forgive me in advance, but maybe, and there are points that have been made at several other conferences and panels on Irish rural towns, but maybe if we say them often enough, they'll begin eventually to stick and something will happen as an outcome. The steady decline of the Irish rural town as an alternative model for urban living outside of the greater Dublin area has already been documented in academic papers, in published forum, in media articles such as these Irish Times ones, in news panels and documentaries. The debate is neither new nor specific to Ireland. Journalist John Healy, and Paddy Shaffrey is here today, wrote eloquently about it in the 1960s and the 1970s. Much of Europe is experiencing the same spatial pull of large urban centres with parallel rural depopulation. This year's British Turner Prize shortlist even includes work by Assemble Architects for their proposal to reimagine a block of abandoned housing in Northern England. But a key question in this ongoing discussion remains unanswered. Do we really want rural towns to survive, or are they an out-of-date model that's no longer useful, relevant, or fit for purpose in the 21st century? Imagine if we had a referendum on the issue tomorrow. Let's just for a moment consider the conclusion that we'd be better off without rural towns. Services like post offices, Garda stations, shops, healthcare centres and cultural amenities could be provided at more convenient hubs located on distributor roads with ample car parking. Housing could be provided in low-density settlements, detached with plenty of space for car parking, trampolines, privacy. The space formerly occupied by streets could become shopping districts with roofed malls so that you don't get wet and are increasingly wet post-climate change days. And we could even preserve a couple of selected heritage towns, the really pretty ones, as examples of what Irish rural towns used to look like. And we could focus on their tourism potential with strict planning and conservation guidelines to prevent anything new being built in them. Is this all starting to sound familiar? It's because we have in effect, if not in fact already voted no to the rural town. Aided and abetted by poor planning since 1963, a lack of coherent spatial thinking at national, regional and local level, we've facilitated, even promoted, the rejection of the rural town as a dynamic, useful and relevant way to live. Conor Skean at the Housing Agency recently argued that the attempt to offer a one for everybody in the audience strategy in the now defunct National Spatial Strategy was its fundamental flaw, and he rightly pointed out that it was naive to propose a nested hierarchy of rural towns with aspirational levels of population growth purely by willing it to be so. We can't make people move to the country, and nor should we. And just how the new national planning framework that the Minister mentioned will fill that void left by the National Spatial Strategy is not yet known. But it is clear that we need an ambitious vision for the types of places that towns can be, rather than simply standing by as they morph into a continuous suburb. Towns were and can still be unique places that support people who would like to live in them. Towns can be part of the solution to Dublin's housing shortage by offering an alternative. The space is there, but current restrictions on movement of those on housing lists between local authorities prevent empty housing in one local authority being offered to people on the housing list in another. Patrick Geddes, who's considered to be one of the founding fathers of modern planning, first coined the idea of the valley section, which identifies the interdependence of country, town and city. I would suggest that we've lost sight of the importance of this interdependence in a properly functioning country. Colin asked me to speak specifically about small houses in rural towns, but I'd just like to preface the rest of the paper on the need to consider future planning in the context of an integrated and supported approach to national, regional and local planning, recognising the potential to better plan our cities, town and countryside by more deeply considering the interconnectedness of each. Dublin needs the relief of rural towns just as much as towns can benefit from the population that Dublin cannot service. The rural town as a viable alternative urban model to the city shouldn't be overlooked as a valuable component in the spatial future of the country. In the rest of the paper, I'm going to outline the benefits and potential of two small rural town dwelling typologies, as well as the challenges that they bring, and argue for alternative models of urban design that give towns a chance to be part of the solution instead of just the persistent problem. Hope you can see that slide. Housing within existing town cores generally comprises about four types: over the shop, compact urban, stacked or apartments, and large urban. Comparison maps showing the distribution of house types in Westport, Bandon, New Ross and Longford demonstrate that the majority of dwelling function associated with rural towns is now suburban. So it's the purple colour on these town maps. And the types that I'm going to be speaking about mainly are the dark green types, which are compact urban, and the turquoise types, which are over the shop. And these four maps just illustrate how little of towns actually reuse those typologies currently. The increase in low-density suburban housing is due to several factors. They're cheaper to construct, about €930 per square metre. They tend to have an easier route through the planning process. They're specifically designed to cater for vehicular access and contain private gardens, and they can provide larger area dwellings, all constructed to contemporary building standards. So it's not hard to see why they represent an easier option. However, this popularity of new-build suburban housing presents us with two challenges. Firstly, what do we do with all of the existing residential building stock that makes up most of the fabric of our rural towns? And secondly, despite the individual convenience of low-density housing located on the edges and outskirts of towns, continued sprawl can only result in higher car dependency, increased carbon emissions, impact on health of longer car-based commutes, higher frequency of flooding due to increased impervious land cover, and degradation and erosion of green belts between urban areas. If we're to take these issues seriously, it not only makes sense to adapt and reuse our existing urban housing stock, it's imperative that we do so. So I'm just now going to focus a little bit on the characteristics of two of the four urban typologies that I identified, living over the shop and compact urban. So firstly, living over the shop. Most of you are completely familiar with this conversation, but it's more like a quick recap. The typology comprises the buildings of mixed retail and residential function, usually located along the main streets of towns. They can be 2 or 3 or 4 stories in height. They tend to be accessed either through the retail ground floor space or through a separate entrance to the street. Blocks containing this typology tend to lack green space, as has been pointed out earlier, either in the form of private open space or shared open space, and there's sometimes access to the back of the plot via laneways. While historically it was seen as attractive to live above your place of work on the main street, this appears to be no longer the case. Reasons for this change may be linked to a greater demand for ease of parking and access to upper levels, to private gardens, and concerns for lack of safety of the street as a play space. Living above the shop is limited to a small but important part of the urban core. The buildings are usually located on one main street or a handful of secondary streets in the town. Much of the discussion about the demise of rural towns has focused rightly on the decay associated with vacancy on main streets. And my estimate of vacancy along main streets in the case study towns that I looked at back in 2011 was an average of about 30% of space at upper levels was vacant. The second typology is compact urban, and this constitutes what we know as the grain of most rural towns. Houses can vary in size, but they tend to be terraced, with yards or gardens to the rear and built of simple masonry construction. Their terraced form allows them to form streets and blocks and to frame our public spaces. The typology is less difficult to adapt than over the shop because of lack of commercial function at the ground floor, but compact urban houses by their nature tend to be small. If you take an average plot width, like these houses, of about 4 to 5 metres wide and a plot depth of about 8 metres, you can see that the average area of a 2-storey house is roughly 65 to 80 square metres. I did a recent straw poll of delegates at the National Housing Conference, and that indicated that 120 square metres is seen as the appropriate average size of dwelling for a family of 4. Very few compact urban 2-storey houses are 120 square metres. Bins, bikes, all of those things of living often have to come through the house to landlocked back gardens. Many of these houses require quite radical spatial change, which can in some cases be accommodated to the rear. The house type directly continues the street edge, so the ground floor front room has a window directly onto the street, and while that's great for the passive surveillance of the street, it can pose a challenge for diminishing privacy for the occupant. These two typologies face the following challenges, some of which are shared and some of which are unique to both of them. Firstly, cost and cost of adaptation. When mixed retail and residential buildings come to the market, a premium is often attached to them because of their perceived commercial potential of the ground floor space. The premium can be imbalanced in that the quality of the dwelling space can be quite poor, but a prime retail space on a main street can demand a disproportionately high asking price. So if we take, for example, this dwelling currently for sale on Bridge Street in Westport, its asking price is $350,000. It has a 24 square metre commercial space and the area of the dwelling is 107 square metres. Refurbishment and retrofit would cost in the order of about €600 to €950 per square metre, bringing the overall cost in the region of about $430,000 to $480,000 for still a very small home, albeit with a very small shop included. By comparison, a new build 120 square metre house was estimated by the SCSI this year to cost €256,500. So you can see the disparity there. And this illustrates one of the main disincentives to the reuse of existing building stock. Secondly, obsolescence. Many of the empty buildings along main streets aren't on any estate agents' books for sale or for rent. They're simply remaining empty in a holding pattern without any immediate plan for reuse and contribution to the urban decay of many towns. Lorcan Sir has recently pointed out some of the reasons for buildings lapsing into obsolescence, which include properties left to family members without the interest or the ability to reuse them. Perhaps those family members are ageing or living overseas. Also those owners whose family have relocated to a new home, but they're reluctant to sever ties with their old one, perhaps because of emotional memories of the property. The CSO estimate that about 10,000 buildings fall into obsolescence annually. Thirdly, size, which has already been touched on. The contained nature of over-the-shop dwellings can be seen as limited in its potential to extend either outwards or upwards. Private open space can be limited by the rear boundaries of enclosed urban blocks. External play space for children can be restricted and the streets seen as unsafe. Interestingly, the size of Irish homes increased consistently between 1997 and 2009 by a net 14.4%, a much higher rate than our European neighbours, whose house sizes increased by a modest 3% over the same period. The growth in house size effectively wiped out all gains made in thermal performance of homes over the same period. Perhaps it's time that we question a little bit more deeply how much space we actually need and to place a bit more value on quality over quantity. Fourthly, commercial rate rebate. Current rebate rates for vacant space disencourages adaptive reuse of upper levels of Main Street buildings. Where the ground floor is seen as the income-generating element of the building, there's little perceived attraction or ability to refurbish or reuse upper floors. I think I've missed one there, haven't I? Yeah, planning and conservation. And it's been touched on again already this morning by Gonia. Conservation status of properties in architectural conservation areas or as protected structures represents significant obstacles to any prospective new owner, to whom the risk of delays to a refurbishment or change of use or other adaptation is currently unquantifiable. It's inconsistently applied across different local authorities, and therefore it's almost impossible to accurately cost for anybody planning to do so. Fire, again, it's already been touched on, but fire regulations pose a particular challenge in many narrow plots because of the single vertical circulation over 2 stories high. Protected stairwells and or second means of escape may be required, so you have the application of 21st century codes in 18th and 19th century fabric, which often brings conflicting fire engineering solutions in contradiction to the heritage character of the fabric. When I travelled across Ireland presenting the research initially a couple of years ago, one item that was always brought up was antisocial behaviour associated with pubs. Whether or not this is true, it's certainly something that is perceived in many towns as a disincentive for people to live on main streets. And finally, there's a perception that living above the shop is living in a flat, not a house. My experience of living for 12 years in a rural town has taught me that there's a very strong attachment in rural areas to ground-based living. Not totally ground-based, but at least to have a foot on the ground. Apartments are generally seen as transient accommodation for rental rather than long-term ownership. These reasons militate against living over the shop model and to a lesser degree against the adaptive reuse of the compact urban typology. However, the space is there and it's in the interest of rural towns, of intelligent reuse of our existing resources and of the future vibrancy of places and the day-to-day health of its inhabitants to adapt the space for residential reuse, to refit it to contemporary standards of space provision, light and energy. So what can we do to address the challenges? If we break them down into types, you can categorise them as design-based, legislation-based, cost-based and culture-based. So firstly, looking at design-based, we have the design skills to adapt these buildings, to repair street edges, to make great courtyards and private outdoor spaces and wonderful, comfortable homes. We developed a strong culture of architectural design that respects the heritage of existing urban and built fabric and that can shape contemporary space with beauty and integrity. But design will not change the status quo alone without the structural reforms that support it to do so. I would argue that the cultural challenge of providing housing that has no ground floor footprint is very difficult to support as a long-term family rural home, and that a new adaptive typology that accommodates ground floor living space and a connection to external private space as part of the home is an important element in sustained reuse of the living over the shop typology in rural areas. In order to achieve this, I propose that we should begin with a coherent and collaborative design that starts at the urban scale of the block. The process would address car parking, shared open spaces and gardens, potential pedestrian connections across the block, realignment of rear boundaries, potential for extension upwards but also rearwards through the block if needed. In other words, that we begin with the urban design and progress in scale to the design of the dwelling. This is a spatial challenge and demands a skilled spatial design solution. And these slides just illustrate when that process is applied across one block in Westport, which I carried out as part of my research. Now, when I presented that proposal, I was often asked, how on earth would you get that to work in practice? And I would suggest that for this to work, that urban redesign should involve the local community groups, property owners, tenants, local authorities and designers in a first stage collaborative design process to establish the long-term urban design aims block by block, which can then form a framework that facilitates future adaptation and reuse of buildings within an agreed design framework. Collaborative design is developing currently in Ireland. We recently trialled a collaborative geo-design workshop in Mulranny in County Mayo, which brought together locals and designers, academic experts and local authority planners to work for 2 days to design a plan for Mulranny village and its surrounding landscape. And I would propose that we could pilot a similar process in rural towns. The proposed ITWN expanded network could be used to disseminate such a methodology once it's tested and refined. So instead of, this is a very important point that I want to make, that instead of consultation, where you present an already designed plan and get feedback on it, instead you have collaborative design, where the community, experts, designers and the local authority are working together right from the beginning to design the vision for what they want their town to be. In addition to these design-based supports, I suggest the following other actions to address cost, culture and legislation-based challenges. Firstly, funding. We need funding for targeted and focused pilot collaborative projects in a selection of towns, which can demonstrate the potential for redevelopment from the scale of the urban block to that of the dwelling. So it's unfortunate the Minister is gone, because I was going to say, I have an innovative solution for you, Minister. Secondly, that we do extend the Living Towns initiative to all towns. And while at the moment in Dublin, the Speaker mentioned this morning that it's only currently being applied, I think, in 7 properties in Dublin, I actually think it might work more easily and more effectively at the scale of the rural town, where you're not looking at such large buildings as are being dealt with in Dublin City. Thirdly, that we have active support from local authorities, including planning, building control, heritage officers, to support and assist those who take on adaptive reuse projects in towns. And again, just to re-emphasise what this point means, instead of when you go for a planning consultation, you're told, well, you have to jump over this hoop, this hoop, this hoop, this hoop, and this hoop. It would be wonderful if, when you go to your local authority, you're asked, how can I help you achieve what you want to achieve? We're here to assist you to get through this process. That would make such a huge difference to the process and its effectiveness. Fourthly, disincentivization of vacancy through the removal of rate rebate for vacant space and the extension of the forthcoming vacant site tax to vacant building tax for any buildings which remain vacant for a period longer than 12 months. And this point was touched on by James Pike earlier this morning. A good foundation for this would be the compilation of a vacant space audit by local authorities. After all, if we don't know the extent of vacant space, how can we respond in an evidence-based way? I think we also need research on obsolescence to identify the extent of obsolete building stock in towns what causes it, and ways in which owners might be supported to move obsolete space back into usable space through sale or retail or redevelopment. In addition, we could provide practical support for the compact urban typology, which might include identification for areas of residential parking, bin stores, bike parking, community gardens, pocket parks, and then practical advice and help with achieving good retrofit standards for energy efficiency. The majority of these proposals are completely cost neutral. It's worth bearing in mind that 90% of people already living in towns like living there, according to the Heritage Council's research which they commissioned. But for many who would like to live in towns, the choice currently looks costly, risky and awkward, and so the easier option is just to purchase a new house on the edge or the outskirts of town. It would cost really very little to change the current situation so that a choice could exist to live in towns which is supported and encouraged and facilitated. It really just depends on a change of mindset from seeing reuse of existing buildings as a series of problems and obstacles to one which sees it as an intelligent reuse of our existing resources. It requires ambition, strategic thinking, and coordination. If we leave it to developers to decide what our built environment looks like, we'll arrive at a version that's understandably motivated by profit, because that's the business developers are in. But wouldn't it be better to design what we would like our towns to be like, and then support models of spatial change to achieve this? We can design models that accommodate a contemporary way of life with all that goes with that, but in a way that also supports the need for the country to reduce its addiction to car-based transport, that supports adaptive reuse of what we have, that recognises the cultural heritage of the existing infrastructure, and that it must adapt and change to remain a relevant part of the plan, not just for the health of rural towns, but for the future of health of our cities and countryside too. Thank you very much.